presentation by Phil Eil just a moment ago telling his FOIA story. And Phil has sort of become a de facto accidental FOIA expert. His thoughts are sought in publications around the U.S. And we're just really going to have a conversation around the Freedom of Information Act, the history of the Freedom of Information Act, and its position in today's society.
Which I feel like I always am compelled to add that the Freedom of Information Act sounds boring, but it isn't. It really isn't. I am currently planning on pitching a book about the FOIA, and the single biggest obstacle that I know awaits me that I will address on page 1, perhaps on sentence 1, is don't go running in the opposite direction. It's really interesting. The Freedom of Information Act actually involves, you know, information about near-miss nuclear accidents that took place. It involves the fight over the transcript and the audio from the Challenger disaster. It involves Hillary Clinton's emails. It involves force feeding at Guantanamo Bay. It involves a prescription drug dealing case that I'm looking into. Once you get into what it actually asks for, John Lennon's FBI file, it gets really interesting. It's got a branding problem.
It really does. It needs a better name.
Yeah.
So what is, and actually let's take one step back.
Sure.
So who are you? I obviously know.
No, that's okay.
Those that were in the previous session know as well, but your role was as a freelance journalist, which can mean about 1,000 different things. But before you ended up in the FOIA world, what is it that you were actually doing?
So I refer to myself as a D-list Rhode Island celebrity, which means that I used to be the editor and staff writer at our local alt-weekly newspaper, the Providence Phoenix, the local equivalent of the Village Voice or the Miami New Times or the Chicago Reader or the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which recently closed. Alt-weeklies are on hard times now, and the Phoenix was an example. It closed in October of 2014, 18 months after the Boston Phoenix, its more famous kind of older sibling, closed. So I wrote furiously for 18 months for them, cover stories about the Newport Jazz Festival, the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, the topsy-turvy world of Rhode Island politics, addiction and overdoses, and everything in between. I have since then, I teach part-time in the English department at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is just up the hill, classes on creative writing and the history of Providence. I'm currently a freelancer, which means I am my own boss and I pitch stories and try to interest people to buy them and publish them, and sometimes that happens. I've written for Salon.com, Vice, the Jewish Daily Forward, Rhode Island Monthly Magazine. I recently published, for example, a piece in Rhode Island Monthly Magazine about the first offshore wind farm being constructed in the United States, which is happening just off the coast of Block Island. And this month I'm writing about the editor of the Providence Journal, our local daily newspaper. So what I cover really runs the gamut from arts and culture to politics to history to Jewish stuff. And in the case of my book project, which was the thing from which my FOIA nightmare, odyssey, whatever you want to call it, sprung off of, that was, for those of you who weren't in that session, a guy that my dad went to college and medical school with is currently in federal prison in Florida serving 4 consecutive life terms after being convicted of a massive prescription drug dealing scheme that prosecutors said led to the deaths of, first they said 14 patients, but they convicted him of causing the death of 4 patients. So that is my first book project. I haven't sold it as a book yet, in part because this FOIA thing held it up. But that is kind of my next big career goal.
So in your view, and we heard the in-depth story in the last session. For those of you that missed it, there'll be video available afterwards.
It's going to go viral, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is, yeah. Why is it that FOIA matters?
Yeah, so as Americans, we are familiar with the Bill of Rights, which gives you rights to do all kinds of things, freedom of speech, freedom to congregate, of course, the Second Amendment. But we have other rights beyond the Bill of Rights. And one of those rights since 1966, it was enacted in 1967, is you have the right to ask the federal government, and in many cases your local government, although it is a different set of laws in each state locally, to ask for information about what's going on. You have the right to ask them to produce information generated in the course of their business, and they have a legal obligation to respond. I'm sifting through my notes here because, here it is. Just a list of some of the federal agencies that are subject to FOIA: Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Education. The list is really long. And you can ask them for something. You can't ask them, questions necessarily unrelated to what they do, but they've got to give you a response. Maybe it's going to be no, we don't have it, or maybe it's going to be we do have it, but we can't release it because it falls under one of the 9 exemptions for things like national security or personal privacy. But they've got to give you an answer. And it's a really empowering idea that is a reminder that this stuff ultimately belongs to us. This is a government for the people, by the people. People are elected. Congress isn't subject to FOIA, which is interesting. They are the ones who passed it, but they are not subject to it. Make of that what you will. But it makes a lot of sense that these people who are taking billions of dollars in national projects in our name every year ought to be subject to some accountability and transparency. And I quoted from Lyndon Johnson's signing statement from 1966, and I'll quote again from it. He said, "I signed this measure with a deep sense of pride that the United States is an open society in which the people's right to know is cherished and guarded." Now, whether we live up to those nice, lofty words is another story, but it's at least a very nice idea.
So 1966.
Yeah.
That's where FOIA, the FOIA story in America starts.
Right.
That's Lyndon B. Johnson passed it.
Yeah.
Tell me a little about the history there around the passage of FOIA, maybe. So you've written extensively about FOIA since you've sort of come across it.
So one of the benefits of being stonewalled for 4.5 years is you have a lot of time on your hands. And if you're being stonewalled under the Freedom of Information Act, and if it's holding up the single largest project you've ever worked on, into which you poured thousands of hours and thousands of dollars and untold amounts of emotional energy, you're probably going to become curious about the Freedom of Information Act. And I'm naturally curious, perhaps obsessively so. So in the last 4 years, I became a bit of a FOIA enthusiast, shall we say. I don't know a whole lot about the founding of it. I know it was a California congressman named John Moss who apparently fought for over a decade to get it passed. Apparently he was really disturbed by what he saw during the McCarthy era in Washington. And as a response to that, fought for this legislation to be passed. It's interesting to note that although Lyndon Johnson released this statement, which many have noted was not, in fact, a signing ceremony, it was merely a statement, his press secretary, Bill Moyers, who of course went on to become a famous journalist, said LBJ basically detested everything about the Freedom of Information Act, and he was dragged, quote, kicking and screaming to sign it. I'll also add that the FOIA was passed in '66, but it was strengthened. A reform package was passed in 1974 following Watergate, perhaps because there was some political will behind it against secrecy.
So '66, it comes into existence. So we're now in the 50th anniversary just passed of FOIA. So we now have 50 years of experience with FOIA, and yet we're still, there's still these ongoing discussions and battles and legal.
And honestly, depending on who wins the election, it looks, in the best case scenario, not so good, and in the worst case scenario, catastrophic for FOIA. But we'll see.
So, in these 50 years, there have been some real great touch points.
Yeah.
FOIA, where FOIA's come to the public's attention more strongly than at other points. There's been this ebb and flow of freedom of information. I know you've pulled together some interesting moments in FOIA history, or some interesting documents.
Yeah. So, sorry. I mean,
No. Do you just want to walk us through a few?
Sure. I mean, I should be clear that I am self-aware about this, as enthusiastic as I am about FOIA. It's never going to be the marquee law, right? It's not going to be like the Controlled Substances Act or Obamacare. It's not one of those A-list laws. It's always going to be the realm of nerds like me, journalists, academics, activists. So we're within a niche, right? But it is a project of mine to spread the word a little bit, because it is exciting and interesting. And I didn't have as much time as I would have liked, but I did put together a couple things. Here's the law. July 4th, 1967, the Associated Press put out an article saying, "The law provides that any citizen may see any government document in the files, but lists 9 categories of material that are exempt from stipulation." I thought that was a nice kind of overall description of what it does.
That doesn't look like it was, headline in the New York Times. That looks like it was buried in section X.
It's like, oh, by the way, this big law passed. So these are the exemptions: national defense, internal personnel rules and practices. The one they really got me on, or tried to, was personal privacy, which is there for a good reason, perhaps leaned on too much. I got to do, if I ever write a book on the FOIA, which I want to, we can come back to that, I'm going to look into number 9. Contains exempt info on gas or oil wells. It's like the super specific exemption that I wonder what it's about. So some examples. The probably most interesting example of the FOIA is you can go online to vault.fbi.gov, and this really is the kind of most interesting entry point to the Freedom of Information Act. And it is their vault of uploaded FOIA records. And if you go to the index, it lists from Al Capone to, White Aryan Resistance is near the bottom, but it was kind of catchier than the ones beyond that. There's stuff on Adolf Hitler, Princess Diana, Malcolm X, Michael Jackson, Steve Jobs, Watergate. I actually wrote a piece in March of 2015 during Sunshine Week, which is the week when journalists celebrate access to information. It's just something we do. And the piece was called "Delving into the FBI's Jewish Files." I basically, for the forward, which I write for occasionally, just went through the FBI's vault looking for interesting stuff about Jewish people. I'm Jewish. I'm interested in Jewish history. I wrote at one point, "Scrolling through thousands of pages of grainy black and white documents might not sound very exciting, but the experience was a bit like roaming through a cocktail party attended by Albert Einstein, Bugsy Siegel, Lenny Bruce, Leonard Bernstein, and J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's director from 1935 to 1972. So an example of FOIA is my case. We'll come back to that. I'll come back to this too. But a prominent example, a recent Frontline a documentary filmmaker in Boston. It took her like 13 years, but she requested photographs of Dick Cheney on 9/11. This is one of them, a trove of photos kind of showing behind the scenes what was going on. You can go online if you Google Dick Cheney 9/11 photos, FOIA, it'll come up. So this is a very tangible and interesting example of the way FOIA can peel back the curtain. A more humorous example are Amtrak cafeteria car complaints. Amtrak is subject to FOIA, and thank goodness, because without that, we wouldn't have things like PAX, which stands for passenger, said he had to pay a lot of money for terrible, crappy food. A message, the worst, I mean worst coffee I've ever had. And here's one that says, "I have run businesses throughout my career. My guess is that If you could bring in a freshman business class from any college in America, I'd offer up suggestions and improvements on your currently abysmal food operation. A new low, and I'm a guy that spends days in airports. So, you know, it ranges from the serious to the silly to near-miss nuclear disasters. This is from The Guardian in 2013. A secret document published in declassified form for the first time by The Guardian reveals that the US Air Force came dramatically close to detonating an atom bomb over North Carolina that would have been 260 times more powerful than the device that devastated Hiroshima. This was in 1961. Kind of interesting, right?
Missed the news story when that happened.
Right. So I can kind of compare FOIA to the ability, when it works well, to kind of look at your government with X-ray glasses and kind of see what's actually going on, sometimes in unflattering ways, behind the scenes.
So I asked Phil to join us because we often hear about FOIA in our profession from the other side in managing FOIA requests and optimizing the workflow behind Freedom of Information and understanding how to process Freedom of Information Act requests, because a lot of folks in this room and at the conference here today actually work on the opposite side of these processes and are evaluating requests from guys like Phil from all around the country. So I thought it would be really interesting to bring Phil into this discussion to hear the other side of that discussion, which we don't often think about from our profession. We're generally thinking about this solely from an optimization and processing standpoint. And it brings sort of the human element of the Freedom of Information Act to the fore. So,
one really tangible example, really important example, it was actually not a federal Freedom of Information Act request, but it was a state level. I think all subsequent to the passage of the FOIA, every state passed its own version. So you can't send a literal Freedom of Information request to the governor of Rhode Island, but you can look up whatever the state law is and send them a request for similar reasons. And in Chicago, a reporter, a freelancer I might add, famously filed a FOIA request for the Chicago police footage of the shooting of Laquan McDonald, an African-American teenager who was shot and killed by police. I forget when it happened, but the release of the film, the footage, I think happened last fall, and it was the result of a lawsuit. It was a Illinois public records law request. But what is more serious and urgent than the public having the right to see who is losing their life at the hands of law enforcement? I mean, that's an example of how serious and vital this work can be. It's not just Amtrak requests. It's stuff that's, you know, vitally important.
Since it is, there are cases where this is, you know, life and death. This is vitally important, as you said. What do the processes look like? Because not everybody here deals with FOIA or has ever seen a FOIA request or filed a FOIA request. There are many in the room who have, you know, this is your first introduction to the Freedom of Information Act as well. How easy is it for someone, either a journalist or a member of the public, to file a Freedom of Information Act request? What does that process look like from a request side?
So the actual filing for me was quite easy. I should add that there are other people who are experts because of the breadth of their FOIA experience. I'm not that person. I've only filed probably less than 20 in my life, whereas Jason Leopold at Vice has 1 million going at once and is, you know, working all kinds of pots on the burner, so to speak. My experience is from the depth of one particular FOIA request, which was a years-long request that I refused to let go. But at the time, what I did literally was like, I knew vaguely the Freedom of Information Act existed. I looked it up, found a template letter, plugged in the information I wanted, which made me sound smarter than I was, and sent it off. I think it was for the cost of a stamp, and that's what started this whole thing. And in fact, it's because you can still do that, and it's still incredibly easy to at least get in the door. It's much more difficult to get what you're actually asking for. But it's even easier than that. There are websites like, for example, Muckrock, where you can pay to subscribe, pay per request. I think it's like $4 per request. And it's online. It's very user-friendly. It's kind of like Mad Libs. You fill in the blank. They have the addresses for state and local offices that you would want to request. You can clone somebody else's request. If you say saw you know, an FBI file request for Steve Jobs, and you thought, well, I want to do that, but for the recently deceased Providence mayor, which is a request I filed, you just clone it, change the name, and off you go. And there are other online services like that. They're really the best, and I have written about them, I should say. But it's super easy, and they keep track of, they send a follow-up on your behalf. So it's not hard to actually file a request. And most agencies are legally obligated to make it easy for you to find how to do it. They are supposed to have a site that lists the information. Whether they do that depends.
So you've now, let's take a hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
You are asking for a piece of information.
Yeah.
You submit your request, which there's a seemingly relatively low barrier to requesting. Yeah. What happens next?
They're legally obligated, I think, within 30 days. I got to check to acknowledge a request. And then they, I think they let you know that they're working on it. In my case, again, which is my kind of limited, narrow experience, they sent it to one agency which sat on it for 9 months, and it didn't go well. Although after that 30-day window, there is no statutory requirement for how long it takes them to complete it. That would make people's lives easier, but I'm sure no agency would agree to, you know, in addition to the law that said all requests had to be processed within a year. They just haven't done that. I will say that as a requester, at least on the federal level, you are entitled to an estimated completion date. It's probably worthless and carries no legal weight, but at least it's a little bit of peace of mind. And I should also add, as I was telling someone in the break, that one of the many disillusioning things about my FOIA experience is by the time I was already in this years-long delay with the DEA, I ended up making a phone call, speaking with a FOIA supervisor, not just an analyst, who didn't know that I was entitled to an estimated completion date. Might sound like a really small niche thing, but it's actually a pretty important right that requesters have, and the fact that a supervisor didn't know a lot about the law she was being paid by taxpayers to administer kind of bothered me.
So what's the, and with your limited experience, this might be a completely off-base question. It's not one that's from the card. But what's the typical experience of someone who is responding to a Freedom of Information Act request? So obviously, you know, it's not the directors of these agencies that are usually responding to individual requests. It's employees. But what level?
Well, I have a friend who works for the government who I've had some interesting kind of on the other side of the fence conversations. And this person, I think what happens is it goes to the analyst, who is kind of the triage person who identifies what needs to happen to fulfill the request, and then it goes up the chain to whoever knows, the non-full-time FOIA employee who knows the answer to the question. So this person I know, will remain nameless, at an agency that will remain nameless, says they got a lot of like wacky, you know, conspiracy theorist blogger requests that, frankly, to this person didn't seem like the best use of their time, and I'm sympathetic to that. I happen to have sent a request that I don't think was in any way trivial or conspiracy theory minded. It was about the evidence that sent a person to prison for 4 consecutive life terms. But I don't think that's every request. If I do write a book about the FOIA, which I'm interested in doing, one of the things I'd love to do is go on the other side of the curtain and putting my biases aside and seeing, you know, what is it like for you guys? What happens behind the curtain?
You could probably meet some people after.
Yeah.
How many free...
Oh, wait, let me just go back to one quick thing.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
So about FOIA processing, actually, so one thing I learned that you can do, which is within your rights as a FOIA requester, you can file a FOIA request about a previous FOIA request. I learned this a couple years in, and it was kind of a revelation. You can FOIA your FOIA, which sounds a bit like a hall of mirrors, and it is. So I filed because I was so pissed off about what was happening with mine, I filed a FOIA for the processing notes for my previous FOIA request. And it revealed all kinds of things, but this was the most notable one. It was an email, a partially redacted email, of course, that says, sorry this has taken so long to get this request. I accidentally deleted it and then had to get my computer guys to recover it when I got your voicemail. Now that I've had the chance to look at it, I noticed that the case was prosecuted in Ohio, and the cases you asked for are all 9 cases, which are out of DEA Cincinnati. Ohio is part of the Detroit Field Division, not the Chicago Field Division, so I do not have access to any of those files. I'm the division counsel for the Chicago Field Division, so I can't get what you were looking for. Sorry. Please let me know if I can be of any further assistance on this one. So,
how long did that sit there?
I don't. That's what it doesn't say, but I know this didn't speed up my request, having it sent to the wrong office and then accidentally deleted, which is what this indicates happened. It's incredible. It's like, so on one hand, this is the most frustrating thing imaginable. On the other hand, it's kind of a miracle that by law they had to release this to me and show these shenanigans. It's maybe the perfect FOIA anecdote.
That's funny. I mean, not funny, haha.
But it is.
Like a significant portion of your life.
Another example is included in those processing notes, I had submitted along with my initial FOIA request the 16-page list of exhibits from the trial that I was requesting, which was an unredacted document, a public document. Yeah, I'll get to you in one sec. And in the processing notes, this unredacted public document that had been a part of my initial request came back partially redacted. In other words, they redacted something that I already had access to that was totally public. These are the kind of things you see. Yeah. I don't, but that adds a third. Yep. Yep. Well, now I know. That
there's an error on.
Yeah. So this is then an example of a three-way mistake. Sent to the wrong office, accidentally deleted, and then they cited the wrong exemptions when redacting.
Now, you've done a lot of research into FOIA. You have a limited experience of your own requests.
Yeah.
Is this a typical or atypical?
Well, I mean, I mentioned in my remarks that in January of this year, the House Oversight Committee, which is, chaired by a Republican and in a Republican House, and they maybe have an axe to grind when they call up, heads of federal agencies from a Democratic administration. But nevertheless, they published a report called FOIA is Broken, which gives various examples of the ways in which the system is broken. And I am by no means the only guy with a story of woe. In fact, when I was getting really frustrated, and I was years into this debacle, and I was emailing reporters to see if they were interested in covering this because I thought it was a newsworthy story, one nameless reporter at a national publication said, literally, everyone has FOIA horror stories. What makes yours so special? Which, A, was exemplary of the climate, but B, was kind of a knife in my heart that this reporter, and we are the class of people who are supposed to care the most about this stuff, couldn't be bothered to write about what I felt was a FOIA failure that rose above the others.
Yeah. So there's still a level, among journalists who are regularly filing FOIA requests, there's dismay, there's despair.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the pervading feeling is if you're on a deadline and or you actually need this stuff, the big mistake I made from an emotional perspective going in was, and it was also a perfect storm of factors, I was so emotionally tied to this project that ultimately hinged on a FOIA request. And if I were to advise people, I would say never, ever, ever get emotionally involved in a FOIA request, because it is a very effective recipe for depression and anger, because that's what happened.
What did you learn? So you took this FOIA request, you submitted it. It came back in various states over a couple of years. Then you finally filed a lawsuit over the FOIA request. How does that process work? So we've talked about the FOIA process. Now, you'd mentioned in your previous presentation about, what was it, 1% of FOIA, less than 1% of FOIA requests then become a lawsuit. What does that process, or at least your experience with that process, look like for you?
Well, I'm looking for just two headlines I found. So it was telling that the year that I filed my FOIA lawsuit, which was 2015, the Associated Press came out with an article that said FOIA rejections were at an all-time high. And later that year, the Syracuse University runs something called the FOIA Project, which tracks FOIA lawsuits. And they noted that FOIA lawsuits were at an all-time high. Those two things are related, because lawsuits happen when rejections happen. And every one of those 500 some odd people who filed a lawsuit in 2015, I'm sure has a story to tell. And I certainly do. What was your question again? It was, what did I learn from the process?
Well, the process of a FOIA lawsuit, what happens?
Yeah, so
how does that happen?
So
you go from requesting to suing. There's a jump there.
Well, in my case, you need someone with the resources, i.e. the money, to help you out.
What type of money are we looking at?
I don't know, because the Rhode Island ACLU took on my case. Wonderful development. I'm so grateful to them. I'm forever grateful to them. And they had two pro bono attorneys from a corporate firm who donated their time. I don't know what it would have cost, but this is a high-priced firm, I'm sure. And so it's really unfortunate that in an era when the real line of scrimmage when it comes to FOIA, I'm sad to report, is really litigation. That's where stuff either gets released or doesn't release. It doesn't get released. And I admit that in my case, it was a complicated request. I was requesting otherwise private medical information that had been shown in a court of law. It was not an easy answer. And I just regret that once we got to what ended up being a really fascinating legal argument, a tug of war, it's that we were having this really substantive and worthwhile legal argument 4 years after the trial in question had taken place. It's helpful perhaps to think of FOIA as an ongoing tug of war between these two impulses that are always at play in our society. Transparency for a particular reason, be it accountability, or in my case, the judicial system, versus the sometimes, well, lawmakers decided when they passed the FOIA that there were legitimate instances for keeping things private, national security, and there are, even I as a transparency advocate and journalist admit that there are reasons for certain things to remain private, but it's always a tug of war between those two impulses. And I will add, on one hand, I was the guy who had this enormously disillusioning experience on so many levels throughout the FOIA process, but it did have a happy ending in that we got really lucky with our judge. He was a wonderful, considerate, well-prepared judge who asked very good questions during hearing, and he really saw things from the perspective of, he cited Serial and Making a Murderer, which I, of course, liked, in his decision. And he basically said, I'm not saying that prosecutors messed up here in this particular case, but we can all agree that scrutiny on the judicial proceeding is a good thing. And he said, he granted my wish, basically.
So we're running short on
Yeah.
time, and this is such a fascinating topic, and I know we could continue this conversation for a while, but let me end with a personal, bring it back to your work.
Yeah.
So you got into this to write a book.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little about your writing and your books and what comes next in the world of Phil Eil.
So for a long time, for years, I thought the DEA had screwed me out of my book, right? That I wasn't going to be able to write about this trial because there was this big gaping black hole at the center of my book, which I was resolved to write around, but I didn't think I should have had to have done that. By the way, this is a really serious case. I don't want to make it seem like it's about me, but I'm a journalist, and I had spent a lot of time on this, and I thought it was a worthwhile case. And I didn't see any reason, according to my, having taken elementary school level civics classes, why this evidence couldn't be released. But that project I'm now going to dive back into, whether they appeal and further stall the release of these documents or not. I'm going to get back into that book and tell the story, as I mentioned earlier, what I think is an important story of one of the most prolific prescription drug dealers in one of the most hard-hit areas of the country, southern Ohio, Appalachia, Kentucky. There's an important story to tell there that kind of fills in a blank space, I think, in the narrative. But one of the major kind of mental health, a flip in my mental health came when I thought, a few years into this, well, actually the DEA might have given me a second book project because I got so interested in the Freedom of Information Act, and I realized that there was no kind of engagingly written for a general audience, here's what you need to know, amusing anecdotes and useful advice type book that I'm now committed to at some point, unless somebody in this room steals the idea, pitching that book. I'd really love to be the guy who writes the kind of popular history of FOIA. And this summer I went down to the National Archives where the original signed by LBJ Act was on display. While everyone was upstairs looking at the Bill of Rights, I was one of like the 3 people looking at the FOIA. And I have a whole kind of cross-country odyssey planned if that book project goes forward about the story I want to tell.
Well, so November
15th or 16th.
15th or 16th is the day we will know what happens next in Phil Eil's story.
Yeah, I'll be tweeting about it at Phil Eil.
We will be retweeting about it. Phil, when the books finally come out, we will be sharing those with our audience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for taking the time and telling your story.